So I work in Kevin's group. So my main research is using machine learning to improve system performance. So in this topic is about using Bayesian optimization to improve the optimum cooling as a RHIC system. And it says the RHIC is no longer operational, but I think the technique is very generic and can be used in similar scenarios. And this is my team, and they are very helpful, and thank them very much for the help. They are very important to the work. And today, me and my teammate Lucy will present this work for you, and I will introduce the basics and also the experimental result. And Lucy from Cornell University will introduce some future potential methods that could bring some potential benefit to the performance. So first is our RHIC facility. It contains two 3.8 kilometer counter-rotating superconducting rings where they collide the ions. And the blue, and they call it the blue ring and the yellow ring. And those two rings cross at 6 regions, also called the interaction regions. And they provide the space for the scientists to do the experiment and study the interesting information from the experiment. And the RHIC system we study located at 2 o'clock in the RHIC ring. Here's a quick review of the RHIC system. RHIC is very critical to achieve the luminosity goal in the RHIC run. It was successfully improved the luminosity multifold in 2020 and 21 runs. And here's a brief system overview. The 704 megahertz electron bunches are produced in the photocathode and accelerated in the SRF cavity to the design energy. And then they brought through the transport line to either the diagnostic beam line or the yellow and blue cooling sections, where they co-travel with the ions to cool them down. Okay. So next is motivation. So for cooling the ions, it obvious that the electron should be in the center because we assume the ions are in the center. However, in the real system, there are some BPM measurement errors. So the real position of electrons are not exactly reflected by the BPM readings. So that's why I want an independent way to optimize the cooling, and also which will in turn to help to validate the BPM calibrations. The method we use is called Bayesian optimization, or BO for short. It is a powerful tool for finding the extreme of objective functions that are expensive to evaluate. It got its name Bayesian because it uses a Bayes theorem. So the theorem states that the posterior probability of a model given the data is proportional to the likelihood of the data given the model multiplied by the prior probability of that model. So you will use this formula to update the model in the Bayesian optimization. The whole process goes as the following. So you have this expensive function that you want to optimize. It's very hard to sample from it, very expensive. So you want to minimize the number of steps that you do the sampling. So what you do, you first use a surrogate model to approximate that function. So Gaussian process is usually a popular model. And then you use acquisition function to guide the sampling process. And then you can sample the original function and get a new sample point. And then you evaluate the criterion. If it is met, then you can output the result. Otherwise, you use the new samples to update the model and continue this procedure until you finish the optimization. And before the real experiment, we did a simulation to illustrate to get a feeling of how the BO method can work in this optimization task. And here's an illustration of the scenario. The electrons are traveled in the cooling section, like they do in the real world, and the ions are assumed in the center. And there are 8 BPMs along this line, along the cooling section. So for the simulation, we use a simulator so as not to interrupt the normal interruption of the, so as not to interrupt the normal operation of the live system. The simulator will take the BPM as the input and then output the transverse cooling rate. Ions are assumed in the center. And to get a quick idea of the optimization, we abstract the 8 BPMs into 2 parameters, which is root mean square and standard deviation, to quickly make the algorithm convert. So the BO take 2 input and output is the objective is the transverse cooling rate. And here is the simulation result. We can see so both RMS and STD exhibit a similar pattern. So we only show the RMS here to illustrate the idea. We can see the Bayesian samples RMS is moving towards 0, and also the same for the STD. So that tells us an electron trajectory that has more overlapping with the ions, produce faster cooling rate. So that's good. It matches our expectations. So that indicates the method could work well in the experiment. And next we go ahead to do the experiment in the live system. And here's an illustration of the cooling section. We only consider the yellow cooling section. And due to the time limitation of the machine, we only consider first 4 BPMs in the yellow cooling section. But the method should be the same and can be easily extended to more inputs. So that may require to use a faster method. So later, Lucy will introduce a potential method that could speed up the convergence rate. So the cooling performance. So here we use a basic Bayesian optimization to only take 4 inputs. And the cooling performance is measured by the cooling rate, which is the objective. It's defined as the decreasing speed of the transverse ion beam size. Its formula is here. And the delta is the transverse ion beam size. So from the definition, the decreasing speed, which indicates that a more negative lambda means a faster cooling rate. Ions are assumed in the center, like in the simulation. The goal is to use the BO method to maximize the cooling rate, the flip side of the lambda. So it's a maximization problem. Here is our initial sampling result. To train the BO, you need to get some initial sampling to get some initial samples. So we have 4 inputs and we sample them all together from in a range from -3 to +3 millimeters. And here we do the sampling all together. We also try to sample each one individually, but it turns out this gives the best result. So we use this manner to sample it. And we take 40 initial samples with the step size 0.6. So with 40 samples, they go around the range 2 times. So this pattern also helps to reveal the objective patterns. You can see some input positions like around the 0 position, they tend to produce a higher objective, which is useful for the algorithm to learn what strategies it will take in the optimization process. So before we do the experiment, there is something we need to deal with. So the original objective defined using this formula, use the point value of the beam size. As you can see from picture shown here, the delta has large noise in it. So when you calculate the delta using this noise data, it makes the lambda very unstable. So this is illustrated in the plot down here. So ideally, when the input stays the same, like this section and this section, the output shouldn't be changed so much. But due to this point value and this large noise, even the input stays the same, the objective will change by itself a lot. So which confuse the algorithm, make it diverge because it doesn't know what input produce good output. So this case should be fixed. And we fix it by using an average value of the beam size data. And which gives us a new parameter, which is the number of points to do the average. And if you use different numbers to average, then you can get different algorithm behaviors. Here we tried several values, and here are 2 of them. One is if you use a number too small, then it makes no difference with the point value, like a number equals 1. The objective is still very unstable. It makes the algorithm very hard to convert. However, on the other hand, if you have too many points, then the objective will become so insensitive that even the input goes through the entire range, the objective cannot reflect the changes correctly. So both cases we should avoid. So in the experiment, we got a good result by using 15 numbers, 15 points. And you can see the algorithm can convert to an optimal solution very quickly in 3 steps and can maintain it there, and the objective is stable. So to get the electron position from the real system, we use a log view application from our system. And so after training, the electrons are left in the farthest point, which is -3 millimeter. And then we turn on the BO to control the trajectory. And as you can see, it like in the input, it's in 3 steps. It converts it to the center position and can maintain the trajectory here. So this is a basic approach. And next, my teammate Lucy will introduce some future work that could bring potential benefits to the project.
Okay, thank you, Yuan. So hi, everyone. My name is Lucy. I'm a third-year grad student working with Professor Georg Hofstadter at Cornell University, and I collaborated with Yuan on this project at Brookhaven. So here I'm going to introduce some future work that might improve similar problems that we'll encounter in other accelerator facilities, not just RHIC. So the motivation of why we want to do this is first because, as we have shown before, we only picked the first 4 BPMs as our input parameters due to the limited beam time we had. But the real RHIC system has 16 BPMs in the total 2 cooling sections. And it's also possible that there are other system parameters that can affect the cooling rate that we didn't take account into. So our goal here will be to introduce some other algorithms that can converge faster and can consider more information or parameters for the real accelerator system. So here, I'm going to introduce 2 forms of algorithm. The first one is the physics-informed Gaussian process optimization, and the second one is called contextual Gaussian process optimization. Okay, next slide. Okay. So a brief going to the theory of how Gaussian process work and how optimization is done. A Gaussian process model is a surrogate model that we use. Basically, it provide a probability distribution over the possible functions that will fit a set of training points that we provide to the model. It consists of 2 major components, which are the mean function, mx, and the covariance function, which we also call the kernel, which is the kxx prime. So the kernel here is the covariance functions of all the input variables. And when we have a whole set of input points, we can create a covariance matrix, capital K, which include all the correlations between all the input dimensions. So as we can see in the picture on the top right, at a certain sample point xi, the Gaussian model will give a predicted mean mu and a predicted variance sigma. And the value here you can see is demonstrated with the black line, which are all of the mean values, and the purple area is all the variance. Okay, next slide. And why does it matter that we should have a very good Gaussian process model? Is because during the optimization step, we guide the whole process with acquisition function, which is a mathematical combination of the predicted mean and variance values from the Gaussian process models. There are 3 major variations of acquisition functions, which are the probability improvement, expected improvement, and upper confidence bound. And in this experiment, we use the upper confidence bound acquisition functions, which is merely a linear combination between the predicted mean value and the variance, but the variance is multiplied by a constant kappa that we can change. So we can see from the picture on the right, this is how sample points are guided by the acquisition function. So the next point to sample during optimization is always the point that returns the maximum acquisition function value. So if we have a very accurate Gaussian model that gives us accurate mean and variance values, this process will take less time. So the first few points that we sample will lead us to the actual optimum that we want. Okay, next slide. So here are some motivation for the physics-informed Gaussian process optimization. As we said before, we would like to have an improved convergence rate for the Bayesian optimization algorithm, and that is very dependent on the accuracy of the Gaussian process parameters. However, it's very difficult to construct the very appropriate GP kernels that represent all the underlying behavior or the structure from the data, especially if you have very high dimensional data sets. The second point is that acquiring data, both simulated or absorbed, can be a very expensive process, or it requires a very long computational time. For example, the RHIC simulator that we used for our experiment runs very slowly with all the 16 BPMs inputs. Also, while we were doing the experiment with the 4 BPMs, it takes around 2 minutes or so to get new data points with the calculated cooling rate. And if we want to expand the input dimension, this might take even longer. So our goal here is to develop an algorithm that can find the best kernel and hyperparameters so we can achieve fast convergence with as few data points as possible. Okay. So here, some comparison between the normal method that we use in the experiment, which is called the data-informed method. So the data-informed method is the kernels are empirical, so they're calculated directly from the initial training data we provide, and it needs constant update during the optimization process. And this result will highly depend on what training data you provided to the model to begin with. So in the case, for example, if you didn't provide a very representative data set, then the model will get a wrong idea of how the overall objective function behaves, and you will not get good optimization results. However, for the physics-informed GP method, what we do is we can obtain information about the objective function from the physics model or a simulation model. What we do here is we calculate the Hessian matrix H using numerical differentiation near the optimum found in simulated data. So you collect a bunch of data from your simulation of your system, and then you do a differentiation around the maximum or the minimum, depending on your problem. This gives you information about the local curvature around the optimum of the objective functions. So you can replace the empirically calculated precision matrix sigma in your kernel function with the Hessian matrix H, which contain more information about the actual physics of your problem. So here is an example of how you can change the most commonly used radial basis function kernel for the sigma with H. You can do it with any kernel function that you use. For example, we use Mertern kernel for our experiment, and you just do the same thing with the replacement of the matrix. Okay, next slide. So here are some simulation results that we ran to test how the performance improved with different methods. So to simulate our real lyric problem, we used a text function, which is a 4D Gaussian-like function that is centered at the origin. So here we see the optimization data. So this is after training with initial data points. And we see that both data-informed and physics-informed GP can converge pretty fast. However, the physics-informed method is clearly much more stable once they found the optimum solution. Okay, next slide. The second method that we would like to briefly introduce here is called the contextual Gaussian process optimization. So the context here we define as uncontrollable but varying environmental factor that will affect the objective function value. So for example, in our case, one possible context that might affect our cooling rate is the ion beam intensity, which decreases with time, and then we bounce them back periodically, as you can see from the picture on the right. So how to take into account of these factors is that we can construct a composite kernel. So we can have two kernels. One describes input-specific trend, which is KS. For example, in our case, the S will be all the BPM inputs. And then other describes the context specific trend KZ. So for example, here Z would be the ion beam intensity that oscillates with time. There are two main ways to combine these two kernels. The first one is multiplication, as you can see here, so KX times KZ. This is usually used if your input and context behave in similar ways. For example, if both of them can be described by a exponential kernel, then the product of them will also be exponential kernel. And the second one is summation, so you add the two kernels together. This is more broadly used, so even if your context and your inputs behave in different ways, this way the final kernel will take into account of both behaviors. Okay, next slide. So here is the text function we use. So basically it's also the original 4D Gaussian function, but we added a periodic sinusoidal function on top of it to imitate the behavior of the ion beam intensity we showed before. So this picture shows the 20 initial samples that we used to train the algorithms. Without the context GP feature, the Gaussian model does not know the sinusoidal function exists, basically. So it still takes 4D input as its input. But with the context feature, the model is also provided the value of the sinusoidal function. So basically it takes a 5-dimensional input. And the kernel we use is the summation of both input kernel and the context kernel. Okay, next slide. So here are the results of running both GP, and we see very clearly on the top graphs. So the top left graph is the normal GP model that has no idea that the sinusoidal function exists. And as a result, it cannot capture the behavior of the objective function correctly, so it was not able to converge. And on the top right shows that with context GP feature, the algorithm was able to take into account of the varying context, and it converges in 7 steps and stays pretty stable afterwards with 20 initial training samples. Okay. So here are some conclusion and outlook from our experiment. So we have shown that with the Bayesian optimization method, it is very effective in optimizing the cooling performance at the RHIC systems. It also verifies the correctness of our traditional orbit correction program and the BPM calibrations, because at RHIC before, it's always assumed that ion beams are always at the center, and then all we need to do is maintain the electron position at the center to achieve maximum cooling rate. And it also opens many possibilities of trying different machine learning methods on optimization, performance of the different control tests in both the RHIC complex as well as the future EIC complex. And I'll give one example of the outlook. That's what I'm transitioning to doing the project is at the coherent electron cooling experiment at RHIC. Okay, next slide. So this is just a brief outlook on what could happen in the future and what can be done in other facilities as well. So CEC is it's a stochastic cooler currently working to cool hydrogen beams at RHIC, yes. And the motivation of doing this is that right now, the system, the tuning of all the system parameters are done blindly, basically just manually by an experienced operator to obtain desirable beam status. And any optimization is done by the genetic algorithm GA, which is very time consuming. So we propose that our goal for a machine learning algorithm first is to develop a virtual diagnostic scheme, which can provide a mapping between the tuning parameters and any diagnostic YAG screen image. So we can have a tuning algorithm that will tune to get a good beam automatically. And the second method is more close to what we presented here is the multi-objective optimization. So we can optimize the beam, the peak current, the emittance, and the energy spread all at the same time with the more efficient algorithm. And this, we can use the Bayesian optimization technique we just presented. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here are the references. So we have submitted our paper, and then the other ones are the techniques that we introduce. Thank you.